Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to the ICA. My name's Matt Williams. I'm the curator here, and we're very pleased to have for the talk tonight Narcotecture. We have Blom from the University of Oslo, and we have Kjetil T from Snøhetta, who is the just today they were the winners of the Busan National Opera House competition in Korea. So big congratulations there. And not often that you win those kinds of prizes. And of course then we have Charles Rice here as well from Kingston University. And Blom's going to introduce the talk and the concepts of Narcotecture to you all. And then she'll be followed by Kjetil and Charles, and then be open for discussion and a short Q&A. I'd also like to thank the Norwegian Embassy for supporting the book launch that will take place after the talk. There'll be drinks and food next door, so you're all more than welcome to join us and have a look at the new catalogue that we produced for the exhibition. Thank you very much. Over to Ina.
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be able to speak here about this project, which is completely intriguing to me, and I've been trying to make sense of it in some way, and you'll be the judges of whether it makes sense or not. Anyway, A House to Die In. This is the title of this very particular architectural project on view in this exhibition. And it's a project that is idiosyncratic down to almost every single detail. And we'll get back to that in detail somewhat later, particularly with Kjetil's speech about the working process between the artist and the architects. But anyway, this is the presentation of A House to Die In, and it recuperates and expands on the obsession with death. More or less violent death, more or less drug-related, and more or less sadistic, that runs through the often painful and often very disturbing work of Bjarne Melgaard. Yet in this case, he has also entered into collaboration with two enterprises that are not on any level at all associated with violence, pain and death. Notably the architectural company Snøhetta and the Norwegian housing developer called Selvåg. And I should give you a little bit of background on those two companies. Selvåg is an entrepreneur strongly associated with rebuilding Norway after the Second World War. At the time of severe housing shortage in Northern Europe, the company instigated a radical change in Norway's strict building regulations, introducing new construction techniques that permitted a rationalization and serialization of the construction process, and so open for a rapid production of low-cost homes for everyone. And you can see some excited first images of these new rapid construction homes for everyone, and then a few of the more recent developments they are doing. Snøhetta, on the other hand, is an architectural company that came to international attention through a series of quite imaginative and context-sensitive adaptations of modernist building ideals, and a strong emphasis on the relationship between landscape and architecture. They've done a lot of public building projects, such as the library in Alexandria, the opera house in Oslo, which you can see both in this image here, and also the National September 11 Memorial Museum and Cultural Complex at New York's Ground Zero site. All of these testify to this construction ethos that this company represents. Now, Bjarne Melgaard's collaboration with these two laudable players in the world of architecture and construction then necessarily prompts, I think, the question of whether this particular association between architecture and death may be related to the wider realm of architectural practice and thinking. Can we at all imagine an architecture of death? Does such a thing exist as a practice? Can we actually build according to the logic of the death and the dying? One can of course point to the obvious here, I mean the architecture of funerary monuments and memorials, and possibly also the type of hospital environments especially designed to take care of the dying. However, I do not think that these forms of architecture actually handle the reality of death as exposed in the work of Bjarne Melgaard. And this is because funerary monuments and hospitals, etc., represent a ritualized handling of the dead on behalf of the living, on behalf of the interests of the living. They're serving the preservation of communal memory and the affirmation, basically, of communal values. Society does not, and I think it cannot, officially at least, produce houses of death. It can register, I think, and to some extent even process radical critiques of architecture, critiques of authoritarian monumentality and architectural rationalism as a representative of rationalism of society in general, etc., as the critiques formulated by Georges Bataille, among others. But it cannot, I think, promote death at the level of explicit architectural practice. Architecture is and needs to be foundational in some sense. Unofficially, however, there may be types of housing more closely associated with the reality of death than others. Narcotecture, referring to a type of ostentatiously luxurious mansion built by drug money in places like Mexico City, Kabul, Miami, and Bogota, may be one such example. Now, I first came across this phenomenon in the New York Times Home and Garden section, of all places, where an unlikely celebrity home was documented in glossy images. It was the mansion of Kjetil T, and you can see it here, a Chinese-Mexican businessman who was arrested in 2007 during a raid during which some $200 million in cash was found hidden in the walls, closets, and suitcases in this home that you can see here. And it was reportedly the largest single drug cash seizure the world had ever seen. So massive, as you can see. Now, Stanley was a former representative of a big pharmaceutical company in Mexico. And he was accused of trafficking pseudoephedrine and other ephedrine products that are central to the production of methamphetamine. And he was also accused of being a member of the Sinaloa drug cartel. According to Kjetil himself, however, the cash, $200 million in cash, was in his house because the Partido Acción Nacional in Mexico had threatened to kill him and his family if he did not agree to hide numerous duffel bags with tens of millions of dollars in his home. So these are the two versions of the story, and the case has not yet been settled. But the Mexico City mansion, where Stanley no longer lives because he's in prison awaiting extradition to Mexico, is in the US. The mansion still stands, and it's opulent, as you can see. Multi-Mediterranean style mixes are a kind of monument to the processing of some kind of fast money. Somebody's fast money has gone into this house. And quite predictably, I think, the Home and Garden article focuses on the pathetic details of this house rather than the architectural finesses. It focuses on $5,000 wine bottles with police seizure tags, the single syringe on the wooden table, living rooms more or less emptied out for police auctions of art, furniture, and electronics. And this is, I think, or it would seem, at least as presented in the New York Times, the morally significant evidence of an architectural project founded on paranoia, restlessness, and the ever-present consciousness of imminent death. Death related at once to cartel wars, political intrigue, extensive drug abuse. So Stanley's house stands, I think, as a kind of paean to the kind of drug-constructed magnificence that was often only made publicly visible with police documentation of sudden and violent evacuation. And it is a kind of genre unto itself. these police photos taken in these mansions, and they tend to emphasize a kind of redecoration with bullet holes, broken glass, dead bodies, so to speak, reinforcing this association between death and particular building styles. And this is a particularly gruesome image. I'm almost sorry to show it, but it's one of those funerary homes made for one of the drug cartel members, and then an opposing clan has desacralized it with dead bodies. So it's an ultra-violent scene. I'm not even going to go into the techniques behind this horrible image, but this is all about Mexican drug-related violence, which I'm sure you've heard about. So, what characterizes these building styles, the narcotectural building styles, is generally a taste for sheer muscular size, wayward and often idiosyncratic decoration, a marked lack of attention to context, architectural context as well as social context. It's like, I'm building what I want in this place. And the idea of community values. I mean, these are the key words of ordinary architectural responsibility, right? And very often also a concern for high construction speed. Things need to be built really, really, really quickly, with the result that spectacular surfaces often struggle to hide extremely shoddy construction. Things are often basically falling apart. I'm going to just show you a few images here from Kabul. So, such buildings then speak of the sheer momentary power of an apparently deregulated and entirely subjective building mode. A coordination of fast funds, fantasy and paranoia. Now there are of course much that can be said about architecture and speedy capital. For instance, related to the way in which sheer economic speculation drives urban development all over the world. As Ron Kalyan points out in a very beautiful study of the Indian city of Gurgaon, the result is a new kind of virtualization and deterritorialization of architecture, where the speculative potential associated with futuristic glass and steel dreamscapes is projected onto an economic and physical terrain that cannot sustain it, neither in the short or the long term. Yet I think that this sense of fast money, the type of fast money subtending narcotectural construction around the world, is of a qualitatively different kind than the giddy atmospherics of finance-driven urban development. For while the latter places its stakes in the psychological mechanisms of relentless future-oriented optimism, negating, so to speak, the very possibility of recession and failure and death and all these, unpleasant things, the psychology of drug finance construction is vested in a kind of celebratory yet very unstable now time, informed by the impulse to watch your back, kind of paranoid, momentary ideal, rather than looking too far ahead. So its celebration of gain and accumulation does not so much assert the idea of continued life as the paranoid certainty of life's sudden and possibly very brutal extinction. Now, as mentioned, Selvåg and Snøhetta embody a culture of public responsibility and good governance and democratic practice at the service of a quite non-hedonistic, I think, notion of the good life, a very Scandinavian type of building ideal. I hope you will agree to that. And I think no companies would be less likely contenders for a willing association with luxury, drugs, fast money, fantasy, short-term construction values, waste, and violence. Yet, precisely because of this, their collaboration with Bjarne Melgaard opens for what I think is a quite explicit conceptualization of the outer limits of architectural practice and its relation to the various speeds of capital. A house Custodine does not, however, mimic typical narcotectural styles, but recapture them at what I think is a more structural level. Mainly in a sort of luxurious adaptation of the extreme subjectivity of privatized fantasy. A type of privatized fantasy that is at once kind of in-your-face, monumental, and hidden from view. The main overgrown edifices of this house, and you'll see more images of this later, are on the one hand a kind of kitsch miniaturization of a type of public building, museum, concert hall, etc., made quite small. Still big for private house, but small for the type of style applied. And on the other hand, a monstrous Siamese tiger head in cast brass. These two overgrown edifices are connected underground by a vast space that's actually the hollow interior of the tiger's body. So it's simply to me the strangest building project I've ever seen in my life. And in fact, the entire building has emerged through a strange process, a kind of gradual digital adaptation from Melgaard's expressionistic drawings into geometrical forms that can actually be built. And what is, I think, particularly remarkable about this process is the fact that the surface trades and line movements in very fluid drawings ultimately come to determine the interior spaces of the building, not just the exteriors, but also the interiors, in a haphazard and then quite irrational way that undermine, I think, all normal architectural concerns with known functions and needs. I mean, an architect needs to think about what kind of rooms do we need, what kind of movements, what kind of uses, etc. Here, it's completely the reverse. So these impossible spaces then also come to support an array of non-standard zones of behavior. So there will be a kitchen that is also a pool, a cave office, a storage/TV viewing space, an oxygen/drug room, and some rooms without functions at all. And the whole project then gives us not just hyper-flashy exteriority, as you will see, but also a new form of interiorization that may ultimately be related to the dual dynamics of drugs and contemporary capital. Abigail Ronell, an American cultural history professor, was on the track of this dynamics when she wrote a few years ago that drugs are not so much about seeking an exterior transcendental dimension as the hippie mythology will have it. She said it's more about exploring what she calls fractal interiorities. And her reference here was William Burroughs and his view of drug addiction as an allegory of modern consumer society. And he based this allegory on the idea that the constant, in modern consumer society, there's a constant and very imaginative invention of new needs. Just as the chemical compounds in new drugs invent the craving for new and highly specific types of bodily experiences, however horrific in their implications. I mean, that's the great thing with drugs, right? That you have new bodily experiences that you couldn't imagine beforehand, and new types of drugs that are, oh, this is a great new drug, so you get to feel like this, you've never felt like that before. You can't imagine what it's like. Now, this seemingly simple fact has, I think, some ramifications for our understanding of the link between architecture, political theory, and economics, as strange as it may sound. For in the end, this kind of thinking around the invention of needs, challenges a political economy that bases its model of social exchange on the satisfaction of a set of given or predefined needs that are seen to be universal to all humans, the satisfaction of hunger, the need for somewhere to live, etc. Now, the idea that needs may in fact be invented, multiply, complicates this social ontology at a level that affects the one task that responsible architecture, like the one done by Mr. Thorsen, seems to share with modern sociology. Notably, the obligation to predict social behavior so as to plan, control, and think ahead. Responsible architecture is about thinking how society will behave, based on a realistic analysis of needs. And this is also what modern sociology tries to do. So the unpredictable creation of new needs, going on all the time, linked to the exploration of an ever-expanding and impenetrable interior, pulls somehow the rug away from under such efforts. Ultimately then, a house to die in, and its reference to the realm of narcotecture construction and its subjective imagination in architecture, question the very conception of architectural responsibility. And I think it's this last issue that I'd love to discuss with my fellow panelists here today. Thank you for your attention.
Can you hear me? I'm wondering if I should stand up, actually, or maybe I'll just sit. No, I don't want to. I sit here. I can sit here. Now, obviously, as you understand, we didn't move into this from a certain point of expectation, and I don't think Bjarne Melgaard did either, in fact. I think we established on a non-knowledgeable base a possible result sometime down a line. We were more interested in, like lovers who don't really have fallen in love yet, to understand what was going on in the process when you start learning about each other, when you start going into the depth of certain personalities and you start trying to translate them into visual appearances or understandings. So whatever the result might have been in direction of an architectural element to die in, or it would have been a flowerful sort of end result, which I think partially it is also. I don't think we had any perception of where that would actually end, because if we had that, we would have pre-assumed a possible piece of art that then would not have relied on its process. And in the end, the process for us is what actually brings this result forward. So we encouraged Bjarne very early to draw his drawings of possible houses. You will see a series of these drawings that actually relate very strongly to imagery that is already deeply embedded in some of his drawing techniques from earlier. But you will also find some uniquely new ones which you've never seen before, simply because of the task of having to draw a house. Now, if you take this into consideration, and with sort of the forces against in Bjarne's own creative will to actually do house drawings of possible houses, you must imagine how embarrassed he was when he presented this. And it's the beauty of this embarrassment that actually evolves into a possible and futuristic way of looking at not something postmodern, but maybe in effect anti-modern in that sense. So I think, you know, when we had these situations going and these drawings kept coming and coming and coming, and sort of never-ending drawings of possible houses, and not coherent. It's not like a client who designs his own house, because these are drawings. These are not houses, they are drawings. And they're not even necessarily perceptions of possible houses, and definitely not yet perceptions of possible interiors. So to organize this in a way, and you know, we're architects, we think process. To organize this in a way, we needed to create a roadmap for ourselves. To understand when different elements start relating to each other in a sequence of possible roads that might have become blind alleys or not. Just to see what type of forces would release themselves during this process in order to move from A to B. So it wouldn't be a stagnant process which would become sort of inwardly impossible to fulfill and sort of kill itself simply by the way it is. So in order to find this, we started taking certain drawings and trying to calibrate a certain line depth or understanding of a drawing into a three-dimensional representation through not scanning, because you can't scan three-dimensional, you can't scan a drawing which is two-dimensional into third dimension. So there is an interpretation here of a drawing, the back side of this drawing that Bjarne has been thinking about, but which he hasn't drawn. It's not like a house with 4 facades, you know what I'm saying? You can't, there is only one drawing. So this interpretation and then the calibration between trying to understand the level of input that then this drawing actually entails, and to get that understanding by reaction back from Bjarne, led to a calibration between us and him. So this was the first head which we then fell in love with. And of course, these 3 dimensions here consist of massive amounts of small points on the surface, computerized, which are connected with lines generating triangles, as you know. Which then again led to the continuation of this particular translation of drawings into possible buildings or possible volumes. So in the same manner as we had done with the head, we now started to do with the house drawings. It was traumatic, I can assure you. Almost an impossible route to go, because there is no relationship to the actual hardness or the depth in the drawing to start looking at it three-dimensional. However, we started daring, and you will be able to read and see certain one-to-one translated elements from the drawings into three-dimensional representation, which then became different facades, and all of a sudden you had a volume similar to the volume that you had from the heads, but in this particular case, now consisting of many different drawings. In parallel to this, which we were interested in, was trying to look at different types of surfaces and try to evolve those with Bjarne. But I won't go into depth about that. Let's move forwards. Okay, at a certain point in time, this meeting point of creating a model of a possible house and the color of the house became one. The abstraction of something is not necessarily represented through the color it has. It's only represented through the way it reacts between its shape and its color. So the aesthetics that you actually produce on top of what you're trying to achieve is not its own layer. It's embedded in that particular form. So the color itself does not move back and forth as a separate element of that expression. And that, of course, then leads us to black. And black leads to death. So the sequence is clear. It's not very mysterious. What is mysterious, however, is how we could actually, within 45 minutes, get to this conclusion. Where other conclusions took days and days and days and days. Some elements in a collaboration between an artist like Bjarne Melgaard is self-conclusive. It doesn't need to be nourished. It is nourishing itself to get to a certain level of expression. It's like mythological almost, in the sense that it is being created by itself. So the blackness, of course, then suggests coal, blackness, burnt. So very quickly, during that roadmap session, which you see here, very fast, in fact, the blackness of this was happening. And the surface treatments of these, which led us to the belief that we could actually design a house with wrinkles, which was an aged house in a sense. At the same time, we took this very naturalistic representation of his drawings into the blackness. It must also be said, maybe here, although it doesn't have a vital element in itself, is that Bjarne Melgaard's studio in Norway burned down by a random rocket New Year's Eve before he moved to New York. So you can see this house is burnt on the surface from the outside. The 100% triangles which we have here are being reduced down to only 10% of computer information. Yes, it's the same drawings, everything is the same, it's just boiling it down to almost a reduction level where it loses its intentional and authentic shape. It's not an abstraction though. It's a reduction. And there's a huge difference between abstraction and reduction, as you know. This is the 25% from different sides. And this is what we ended up with when Bjarne saw this 10% thing. He said, okay, 10% sounds great. So you see, sometimes this sort of surface treatment and the in-depth reactions are depending on how the constellation feels that particular day with the type of work that we're actually doing. Here you see the house with the wrinkles. Well, this expanded itself completely into the inside, where we started having to take into account the not livable and the livable. As you will hear Bjarne say, he likes the Beauty and the Beast. Or he might go into something which is so contradictory in itself that simply by being contradictory, it releases a new sensation. And this particular sensation we were looking for in contradictory terms of functions. We started locating it on some. Here you see, first, very simple thematics, like swimming and eating, or working and spa, which seems ridiculous to me, but it has a lot of meaning when you put these type of spaces together in a larger context. If it's only one, swimming and eating, makes no sense. But if you have the series of them, then all of a sudden it makes meaning. Because the series of contradictions that you establish in the house then say something about the spaces that you cannot design. It doesn't say much about the spaces you can design. You know you cannot design a bedroom. You know you cannot design a kitchen. So it says everything about what you cannot design, but it doesn't tell you what to design because it doesn't exist. The bathtub dining, I think, you know, we have TV dining, but bathtub dining is much better, you know, sushi in the bathtub. No, but there are these type of relationships of things, and singular pieces, they're uninteresting. In combination, they're fantastic. We started working with columns, towers, the drug room, which you see here, which could also be, at certain points, airless, or it could be with a very high or low pressure. So it could be reduced down to a space where you would actually breathe heavily, for instance. So you see, we started also then involving ourselves into all kinds of other drawings that Bjarne were interested in and trying to redefine them as three-dimensional objects. Not only these things, which then further on led to the effect of what Ina has been talking about, the negative space. Now the negative space in our case is bigger than the positive space, but it's underground, and obviously it's shaped by removal and not by adding. So that is the old-fashioned way of sculpting, where you remove something to shape something instead of adding something on to shape something. And this combination between removal to shape and adding to shape to us became the most interesting aspect of this design issue, because the shape that is being removed was tested with all kinds of different animals. And there is only one ideal animal that you can introduce as a ground animal into this site in Oslo, and that is the two-headed Siamese with a Siamese two-headed, one-bodied tiger. We had hundreds and hundreds of tiger drawings with the most incredible expressions, and each and one of them was saying something different to this particular place. We were stretching and looking at the sizes of the body and tried to implement this relationship between this burnt black, positively shaped building and, which you will see, the sort of stretched tiger body that is then underground. But these drawings started indicating to us that there is something about depth and the grey scale in every drawing, which is very, very specific for Bjarne's drawings. So we were analyzing his drawings almost like from a technical expertise point of view. And of course the same with Savannah, the dead porn star, which was for a long time intended to be some sort of substructure for this whole house. And you will see that again turned into animals later to carry the house as columns. And in between all this, the interiors demanded, of course, also reflection around furniture or new furniture. And we started very early talking about blow-up furniture for different sexual positions or pornography-related elements that you could imagine would be part of certain comfort zone. I mean, like the distance of this particular furniture would not put you into a position where you would dislike what you were going to do. You would have to like the negative aspects of pornography in order to like this piece of furniture. We then produced it, and you will see that in the lower upper galleries, that we have two pieces of these furniture exhibited. And at the same time we started then for this exhibition developing these woven woolen carpets, which you see, which actually made for keeping people warm normally in Norway, or anywhere in the world basically, but they're produced in Norway. And the color schemes and everything started happening. So you see here the choice of the tiger, the underground situation, and then the collage strategies of models being sent back and forth, and drawings and roadmaps. So all of a sudden, these things were growing so heavily together, very different from the work we had been doing with, for instance, Olaf Eliasson earlier. Completely the other way around, in the sense that here there was nobody was afraid of breaking barriers on the other person's copyright kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? There was absolutely no way that, oh, I'm losing my art if I touch this or if you touch that. No, nothing. And I think it's probably the greatest challenge to work with an artist, or for an artist to work with an architect, is exactly to let this piece of ownership go. You can imagine, in German, we have practiced this for years in Yugoslavia. We called it Mischkunst. And it was painted by many painters at the same time. We've seen that happening throughout the ages and since the mid-70s, at least what I know from in Austria. But apart from that, this takes it further, ending up with this exhibition that you see for now, and a possible house finishing in 2016 at the latest, with one element of burnt oak wood prototype in the exhibition, the models exhibited and the process. I think for me, the content of this is not how we define or redefine it. Whether it's narcotecture, whether it's a house to die in, whether to Bjarne it will be a house to live and work in, to be able to die in, or whether he will take drugs, which he and we will do, but whether that will be the driving force, I don't know. What is the important thing is that this dynamic element of moving one design forward based on totally different collaborative models in a non-collaborative architectural art world, to me, is the most important, and is also the most important experience to me. in this process. So, thank you.
May I have the sorry. Well, it makes perfect sense, which means that we still need to keep discussing it, I think. What I'd like to do is to have a different kind of take, I guess, on the project. And this may be represented by this slightly oppositional seating arrangement. I haven't been involved in the process, but like you, I've encountered the work since it's been exhibited. And I chaired a session between two colleagues, Ben Highmore and Adrian LaHood, last Friday in one of the Friday Salon sessions, where we began to try and draw out some thematics that might begin to position the work, not to try and pin it down, but almost to put it in a field where we might begin to discuss it, maybe outside of the process through which it came into being, but nonetheless try and interrogate aspects of process and aspects of kind of collaboration, or actually probably more interestingly, a kind of non-collaboration, a kind of moment where things don't quite cohere and outcomes aren't quite established. So I want to just probably very briefly position the work downstairs in relation to two other pavilions, one ostensibly an art installation and the other a kind of architectural installation. Between a kind of a rough and a smooth, in a sense, and between projects that relate to materials in a particular way, and then a project that relates to the digital in a particular way. So to try and understand that kind of field, and maybe also to reposition the question of death, or the question of the organic or the inorganic, and in some way the reanimation of inorganic matter into some kind of life, into something that might be something like an artificial life. So I want to very briefly reflect on this project by Alison and Peter Smithson with Eduardo Paolozzi and Nigel Henderson, a project called Patio and Pavilion, exhibited in 1956 at the This Is Tomorrow exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery. And the question that is raised outside of a kind of, or maybe because of, a kind of resonance with what's downstairs in terms of a material project, a project where there is material kind of strewn around, the order in some ways needs to be discovered by investigation. This project, which for me is about the question of what holds a work together. And I think this is a key question actually for the collaboration, is what might hold a work together, and at what point the work is at the edge of being held together, and maybe that is precisely where the work happens. So we have here the project which the Smithsons set up as almost a kind of pavilion, almost a kind of taking back to a degree zero, an interest for them in the at hand, the rough, the as found, an attempt also to come to grips with a kind of here and now, and a construction that might be made through the simple assembly of materials. One of the stories about this project is that the Smithsons set up the basic pavilion, the sort of shed-like structure, and arranged it in a kind of patio space, and then left the project. Paolozzi and Henderson then came in with a kind of arrangement of objects around that pavilion that both belong to it, but somehow also overwrite it, that somehow produce this kind of effect of things strewn around, of things kind of covered up or also uncovered. What's also going on here, which I think resonates in incredibly interesting ways with what's exhibited here at the ICA, is a sense of temporality that plays against the temporality of a process. So we've heard the account really of the process of collaboration, which is certainly non-linear, which has moments of a spark of recognition, the recognition about color and form, for instance, the laboring and battling through other aspects of not quite getting to a decision. Here we have a kind of temporal trajectory, which is also about, is this a kind of future condition? Is it almost a kind of post-apocalyptic condition? Quite where does this pavilion sit in an exhibition called This Is Tomorrow? the moments here where what is uncovered is a kind of fossilized sense of matter become dead, the organic becoming matter perhaps to be reanimated, but dug down and recovered, a kind of almost prehistorical sense of time, but also very much for the artists and architect are here and now, that this is what is being created in the moment. So there are questions, I think, and we may discuss these, around temporality, that is not a simple temporality of a kind of discovery of a moment of sort of the aha moment, which is a kind of the cliche of the architectural condition in some ways, that there's something much more interesting in terms of collaboration there. And, you know, the sort of artists there and architects being apart from the work, the sense that they've made it with their hands, and the sense that there's something about, which I think is very interesting downstairs, about this overwriting. The Smithsons having left the project, and Henderson and Paolozzi coming in and overwriting that project in the nature of the installation. And I think one thing that's very interesting to discuss is the sort of nature, and I mean that kind of quite literally, of the installation that's downstairs. It produces a kind of curious confusion between the animate and the inanimate, the living and the dead. And I think in some ways that's the question of life, or one of the questions of life in the project. It probably needs to be noted that there was always another house, there was always another pavilion that the Smithsons were working on at exactly the same moment for the Home of the Future exhibition, also in 1956, the Daily Mail exhibition, where they were working with form in a very, very different way from the patio and pavilion, where they were imagining what new material possibility could be and how that would impact upon a domestic arrangement and the form of that arrangement, in advance, in a sense, of that material or those production processes having actually emerged. So this was a kind of future projected. But those two conditions held very much in tension in their work. So we don't simply have the kind of rough as against the smooth, but there's this kind of compromise formation in their work, that these things are being held together. And I think that's incredibly interesting in terms of the digital techniques that model the Melgaard drawings, and the way that there's this kind of contamination or pushing or compromise, not in a sort of negative sense, but two things being held together in a kind of tension. And I think that's what we've seen with this sort of Smithson's work. That jumps into the second project I just want to briefly talk about, which is another kind of degree zero pavilion in the short history of digital architecture, the Embryological House project by Greg Lynn from 2000, which was also exhibited as a partial one-to-one construction at the Venice Biennale. It's a project which is known now almost kind of historically as the first to come to grips in a very interesting way with processes of emergence and the idea of non-standard seriality that takes algorithmic processes and makes them generative in architectural design. So what is being designed here is not a single kind of house or building or pavilion, but a series that is in transformation through the design process. The software that is used to design these kinds of processes, or projects rather, is animation software. And I'm interested in this sense of a kind of matter being made live and being reanimated through these kinds of processes, and that the house in some ways grows, in some ways is supposed to be embryonic of itself, and that one can design the kind of series and choose the moment of when something emerges that becomes the kind of proper conditions. So I'm interested in this way, perhaps to discuss at what point, especially around those interiors, that moment was found, as it were, in the kind of the reanimation of the tiger, right? The tiger kind of as drawing, but then reanimated, brought into a new kind of life within the condition of the house. And as my colleague said the other day, there was this sort of interesting condition that this software has brought about, where now all of a sudden architects don't design individual buildings, they design kind of kingdoms or families. They proliferate kind of form, and the thing itself takes on its own life. And I just want to end with a kind of slightly sort of cheeky thing really about once again, the history of digital architecture in the last decade, to do with blackness and whiteness, because we have a very interesting return to the black here. This is a project by the American architect Ali Rahim, as it was published in 2003, and here is the same project published in 2006. Now, what happened in the intervening years was the development of a new kind of render engine called the ambient occlusion render. Now, I don't profess to be a kind of computer techie, but what I know is that what that render does is render the effects of light on form in a much more kind of naturalistic, realistic way. So actually, digital architecture in the space of 3 years moved from black to white. What I think is happening with the Melgaard project is that it's returning to black, that there's being this kind of, and we see it literally on the walls downstairs, this sort of scrawling over the cleanliness of the white drawings. And there's, if this kind of digitally driven project in conventional architectural practice is driven by anything, it's something like the cleanliness of the white render and the purity of that form, almost a return to a kind of modernist white purity. But we have, with the literal burning of the material and the scrawling over those kinds of process drawings, a return to a slightly earlier moment in the kind of digital where it had yet to fix itself into the kind of purity of the architectural project. And I think that's a kind of very interesting moment that this collaboration has brought about. So that's probably what I want to say as a kind of person outside of your process, but maybe we can pick up on some of those points for discussion.
To moderate or what, I'm certainly very interested in questions or comments from anybody in the audience. But I might want to respond just very briefly with a question here. You know, as art historians, traditionally we learn that there is an opposition almost between expression and construction. Expression is about this subjective, uncontrollable mode, and construction is a very rational process. And you would divide 20th century into expressionist artists and constructivist artists, as though those two things were completely separate. And then the constructivist artists, of course, went along with the architects, and the expressionists were in the museum, and with the psychologists, basically. And I think that today, with digital techniques, we see a blurring, a very radical and I think interesting blurring of these divisions. And we get to learn that expression is in fact a basis for construction, not just in terms of imagination, but in terms of very precise translation of emotional, effective materials into built form. So I think that picks up a little bit on what you were saying here between, I mean, it's as though this is already intuited in the work of the Smithsons, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the point would be not to say, okay, well, kind of the Smithsons did this in the way that was before, but I think the Smithsons' work helps kind of open a certain conversation about the work downstairs. And it's about this kind of, you know, because I think it changes the terms around which we think about art and architectural collaboration. And it says actually there's something of a non-collaboration, and Kjetil, you used the term also, it's a sort of de-information, or a sort of you know, the reduction to the 10% triangles was something about pulling away, that there's not quite, it's not a culmination point of this sort of art architecture collaboration. And it's collaboration pulling the digital techniques sort of backwards a little bit. There's something about that reduction to the reduction of resolution, which I find incredibly interesting. Yeah. And it's not to say that it's kind of more primitive thing, but it's tracing back from the capacities of the technology. But it's also using those capacities in a way which is sort of startling. One of the great things about the exhibition is that there is email exchanges between the artist and the architectural office, and there's one in particular which details an exchange where I think obviously one of your employees was modelling in 3 dimensions the tiger's head, and it took something like 7 hours. So there was a sort of precision, an absolute precision about modelling this kind of drawing of a tiger's head, which is at the absolute kind of end of a kind of technical expertise that your employees have, but it's a kind of tiger's head, right? But then to pull back on that, in a sense, in resolution, and not to say, well, we can actually, the technology would allow you to pinpoint that thing and construct it exactly. But what you've chosen to do is sort of pull right back, which I think is kind of one of the significant things about that project.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this whole issue of digital and analog approaches in our particular world today is also part of the criticism of the tool, as you know. So it happens just as much from Bjarne Melgaard's side as part of criticism towards the digital tool as being in control of what is actually happening. So the prototypes and everything is, of course, either CNC'd in our office with very, very precise digital information. So it could not look different, and every time you produce it, would look exactly the same. Except for the wood, which would always be different. But the actual representation of the CNC carving would always be the same. So in effect, it is his aversion, in a way, that leads us back to a very strong and analog relationship to the way we deal with the digital.
But do you have a sense that these new digital techniques open for a more overt discourse with your company of emotion in architecture, that this is something you're taking into account, not just with this project, but with other projects? Or is this so particular it cannot even be related to the other things you do?
No, not really. I mean, this is quite special because it's also for us like a research program. And Bjarne sees it also as research. He's researching into parts of his own artistic his creation of himself, in a way, by creating the house. I mean, if he came to us and said, okay, I want you to design my house, that, would never have worked, anyway. So the digital tool, to me, is just another tool. What can I say? Yes, it's interesting, but, many interesting tools.
What's that about the question of control in architecture and the question of the foundations of architecture as an affirmative, positive practice, and then these rather sinister?
No, this to me is much more about speed. And that's back to an architecture kind of thing. I mean, we can do very, very complex things within a very, very short time frame. And I think controlling and producing without actually producing the drawings, but just the computer files transferred from A to B, nothing in between, is saving us a lot of money. And of course, it's also saving us a lot of headache. And it's putting us in control.
So you have speed and control.
Yes.
So speed and
There's something maybe we can pick up on. I was interested in your allusions to it, about the interiors. And there's a historical connection really to death and the interior. I was thinking of the kind of Walter Benjamin idea of the interior as encasing and cockpit. It's both the extreme form of a kind of identity formation that it fits you, but also becomes constricting in that moment. And he related death to interiors in a very direct way as that's where the detective novel was born. And the detective novel always begins at the uncovering of a dead body. And he has this sort of line about the sofa. He says, on that sofa, the aunt cannot but be murdered. There's already this kind of... So in the most cozy, in the most homely, in a sense, regardless of the kind of, in the most conventional is already that kind of death, that constriction, the constriction of furniture, really, in some way. And so once again, this is sort of carried through in this, or resonates with the project, I think, in an interesting way.
Yes.
Is the tiger like the kind of cockpit in a way?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, there might be many interpretations to this, but definitely it's got to do with this thin layer of skin.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden defines either the cave or the building in either direction, and the shape of that particular very, very thin surface that portrays the cave-like situation is obviously to do with the hollow body, the body that does no longer exist.
Yeah.
So that is, of course, as a representation of wherever you leave, like in Catholicism, you stack the body or you burn it, or you burn it out to leave the positive shape. in the disappearing of something.
I think this also relates to narcotecture on a very concrete level, that so many of these buildings are actually hidden between high walls, and they have a kind of fortress-like exterior to the general public often. So most people don't ever see these beautiful houses except in police photographs. So just the idea of the magnificent building that's in fact hidden and inaccessible and containing sinister secrets. Video as a source of blackness and a sort of dark light. You could actually imagine new social formations, new modes of living, or new modes of non-living. So I would very much encourage you to go and see that. And I think when you start looking at the blackness issue, you find a lot of strange things. There's the Dada artist, Raoul Hausmann, who had a concept of melanography, which is the opposite of photography again, not tracing with light, but tracing with darkness. And again, this for him had numerous psychic and social consequences, etc. So there might be a whole, I think, archaeology of the black to be done here.
But I've seen it lately mistakenly described as a dystopian, which I don't think it is.
No.
And I think there is a breaking point here somewhere, where this thing just is what it is, simply because of the strength of the fact that it entails, say, the blackness. So I find sometimes that the words being used to describe certain things, especially, I don't think Bjarne would ever think of this as dystopian.
I don't think either. But I think if anything, it's, I mean, thinking in terms of social intensities, new modes of being together, new ideas of how you think social exchange is more about it. And that might be thought, of course, very negatively here in relation to drug culture, but it could also be just a positive one. So I think there's a strongly affirmative side to thinking that.
Because it comes back to this issue of actually when one finds, everyone wants to find the house to die in the sense that you find a place where you reach a kind of stasis.
Old people's homes, we call them.
Well, prior to that moment, maybe. But the house you don't want to ever be taken away from.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually that's where the affirmative or that finding that point of stasis is actually quite important. It's that sense of actually of longevity as well.
Exactly. And I think that's how Bjarne perceives it, much rather than the dying in the sense of dying.
Of dying.
And actually makes it more interesting, to me at least.
I think we should, yes.
Hi, sorry for my ignorance, but can you explain a bit of the background of the project, because I don't know about it.
The background per se, simple background. Bjarne Melgaard is an artist. He contacted and has been thinking of, he works and lives in New York. He used to live and work in Oslo. And he wanted a house.
To die.
To die in the end. And
Very old.
no. And he asked someone with a sight who had the ground if they could help him to do a house, and they asked us, and then we started working together. It's actually very simple. It's not a normal client architect situation, though.
So he wants to go and live in it when he's dying?
No.
I think he wants to go and live there as soon as it's finished.
Mm.
And he's born in 1967, I think. 67,
young.
68.
Mm.
So with some luck, he'll have many good years.
Thank you, I understand that.
That's the point we were trying to get at the very end now. That the definition of dying is an expectation of dying. If you like something, where you stay until you die,
But it's also a way of thinking other ways of living. Living through other means than knowing in advance what will happen, having defined your needs, etc. So new types of bodily experiences, that's something which might be destructive, but you don't know.
Yeah, and sometimes they
It's
are.
a big drug thing.
Yes. There's no secret about that. So
because he's a heavy drug user. Yeah, that would be one of the reasons. But I am Colombian. I am very used to live around these buildings which have been produced, and I am an artist, by the mafia barons of our country. And of course, the producing aesthetic is quite similar to the photographs that you were showing. So of course, this talk for me triggers a great interest because I have no idea what this term of narcotecture is doing coming from Norway. and I would like a bit of background. Is this narcotecture title something of a flashy title, or is it really related to the dynamics behind the bizarre, eccentric architecture of the drug barons, and you know, making links in my mind? How do we talk about that and then talk about the Smithsons or breaking in, or what are the bridges that we are trying to construct here?
I think I can respond to that. Bjarne Melgaard is a type of artist who's incredibly interested in almost everything around the world. He's reading books, he's reading newspapers, he's following social movements, and he is particularly drawn, I think, to dramatic scenarios, to violence, to death, to and you know, also being a drug user, he is attentive to these drug-related scenarios and economies around the world. So this has nothing to do with Norway specifically. This has to do with his passions and interests and fascinations and danger zones. So he's been interested in these architectures or narcotectures in various places around the world, and then imagining something out of that, which has nothing to do with those buildings specifically, but which shares maybe certain structural features in terms of these are buildings that you know, we can go into the details of those buildings and see that they're often created by somebody with a lot of money who says, I want this, I want so many columns, I want huge windows, I want Roman this, I want Greek that, and making a very subjective mix.
The photograph is perfect.
Yes, exactly. And so it's this idea that as architecture you could produce incredibly subjective fantasies, but you can also, is it possible for, you know, to think architecture alongside something destructive and negative and short term and not something that's affirmative and, you know, and nice. Normally architecture is something very nice, right? Or at least we think about it as something that will, you know, build society in a good way. So I think that's the basic metaphor here.
Well, can I just make a comment about that? And that's it. Actually, these architectures are not built to last.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the barons are not thinking that this is going to disappear. They are building a society that includes them.
Yes.
Yeah. So they have a very long project in their mind, and there's nothing new about it. They just want to focus with a very
Very good point.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the exact location of the site, and also maybe about the surrounding, kind of the social structure of the area and the architecture of the other buildings in that area?
Very good.
I can? Maybe I should go a little bit back quickly. Maybe here. Maybe here. Okay. It's just outside of Oslo, central Oslo. There is a artist community here called Ekely. Edvard Munch's studio is about here. You have some terrace stepped housing here and here, built by Selvåg. And you have a free wooden area around all of the site. And the site is basically here. And the area is called Ekely in Oslo. And this particular site is called the small forest, you could say, equivalent in Norway, or in Oslo. So yes, it's about 3,500 square meter site. Located on a hilltop. You see exposed rock on the site in these areas. And it sits just on top of this little hillside that you see here, surrounded by protected oak trees.
It is also a what you call suburban, quite affluent area, but discreetly affluent. Typically Scandinavian, bourgeois, not flashy.
No, not flashy, and wooden houses, small, up to 2 floors.
And the house, as I remember, the houses around that area you built like decades ago, there's no contemporary architecture in the area.
There is always 1 or 2 buggers, you know.
Who found the place? Was it a dialogue between you and Bjarne Melgaard?
No, most typically because it belongs to Selvåg. So it belongs to the sponsor. And then we say, okay, it's a great site, we'll take it. You know? I mean, what do you do?
Did you start building it?
Not yet, no. But we've had conversations with all relevant authorities. The problem we have is definition of typology according to the building regulations. Yeah, because it doesn't have a clear-cut typology in a way.
Tiger.
Yeah, the tiger house, or so we have problems in what to fill in the blankets, in sort of the paperwork that we're doing. But everyone's very positive. In all the negativeness, it's fantastically positive.
Are we talking about the temporary house?
No, not really, but a house that can be exchanged, and parts of it might deteriorate, but in the long run can be exchanged because they're produced by the computer. Yes, parts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ina. Thank you very much, Kjetil. Thank you, Charles. It's a fantastic talk, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. We have some drinks next door if you wish to come through. And we have another talk in a couple of weeks with called Surplus Desire, and that's with Maria Fusco, Diedrich Triggerson, and John Roberts. So, yep, if you're in town, come along. Thank you very much. Thanks again.
Thank you.